Sam, I am Sam, I am. Start each day with green eggs and ham. Oh, I shouldn't ought to eat 'em, Sam, I am. Shouldn't ought to eat 'em in a box. Shouldn't ought to eat 'em with a fox. Sooner ought to eat my own fucking socks. Go kick rocks, I'm Sam, I am. I am Sam. It's a standstill, a standoff. It's a stand-up, a grandstand, a grand slam, a culture jam. Culture jamming. In our last episode, we discussed this idea as planted within VALIS System A's plot notes. This idea that Hawthorne Amundsen finds himself at odds between what Philip K. Dick refers to as the bona fide occult, which is what is going on inside Amundsen's head psychically, with what Philip K. Dick refers to as a mumbo-jumbo abracadabra occult. And with respect to the plot notes for VALIS System A, the clues we have about the mumbo-jumbo occult are limited to what we can say about those who have Hawthorne Amundsen under constant surveillance and psychological fuckery and so on. These Nazis that have traveled with Hawthorne Amundsen from Man in the High Castle into VALIS System A. And looking at the possible harmonics in the real here and now, so to speak, as relates to a mumbo-jumbo occult, and what that might look like, what that might be, what to expect from it, and so on. And something to look at, and tough to look at, is the influence of culture jamming. And if you're not aware of culture jamming, well, let's talk about it. Culture jamming, and also known by the term guerrilla communication, is a form of protest activism whereby media is weaponized. Media is used to subvert and influence and fuck with the cultural zeitgeist, its linguistic constructs, its ideologies, belief systems. It's consensus gentium. And the philosophy behind culture jamming is that all of those things that make up the cultural zeitgeist have been exhausted and worn out, and a way in which to breathe new life back into them happens to be to a trickstery, prankster kind of vibe, to insert within trusted sources of media, or just media in general, to basically use truth, to salt and pepper and season the truth with pure bullshit, so that one, has a meal of both the truth and the bullshit together, and they digest that without knowing, essentially, and when they go about mimicking and making mimics of all that culture jam, that it affects the cultural zeitgeist in very, very dense ways, and the culture jam has had its impact, right? Like one example being, like, say the History Channel, right? History Channel shows up in 1985, back at a time when the television, had like 13 channels, and maybe you had a box that gave you a few more. Well, one of those channels was the History Channel, and at the time, it was a source of reliable, credible research documentaries, conservative stuff related to the history of military engagements, and with the the Old West and NASA and different things like that. It was a respected program, you could say. Well, by the 90s, the culture jam had spread. Like, let's put the jam here, fellas, and that's exactly what they did. Whether they did it for ratings or whether they did it for social engineering, it doesn't matter. The effects on the cultural zeitgeist are obvious. And what they did, I think we all know what they did. They started inserting mermaids, cryptoids, Bigfoot, ancient aliens, the this, that, the other. Largely just a whole lot of information that the viewer themselves couldn't vet. They couldn't vet the information, but the information was emotionally satisfying. And like any belief system, it's emotionally satisfying, and it doesn't require intellectual humility to get it going. And in fact, it's best to keep intellectual humility, in the back seat and tell it to shut its fucking mouth, because, faith's driving this bus. And so, culture jam. Well, let's look at the history of culture jamming in our most recent century of years. In 1957, again, we're not saying that culture jamming didn't exist prior to, say, 1957, but that those that came aboard in 1957 did their fair job in pioneering it, let's say. So 1957, you got these two teenage boys. They're having this conversation that takes them to a bowling alley in California. And this conversation has to do with both the absence of, as well as the creation of, a mock satire religion, whereby the goddess Eris, the goddess of chaos, is the head of it. And they'll wind up calling this religion, this farcical religion, Discordianism. And one of the quotes about it says, "You don't know whether or not it's a comical farce disguised as a religion, or if it's a religion disguised as a comical farce." These boys, one of them's a fellow named Kerry Thornley, the other is Tim Hill. And we're going to look at Kerry Thornley's trajectory here because it's rather interesting. Kerry Thornley, still a teenager, he joins the Marines. And he winds up stationed at a Japanese radio base. And his bunkmate there, and pretty much his best bud at the radio base there in Japan, is a fellow I think most of us are familiar with, Lee Harvey Oswald, who a few years later will become arrested for the assassination of United States President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. Well, as happens, Kerry Thornley, again, teenage boy, bunkmates, friends with Lee Harvey Oswald there at this Japanese military base. He's impressed by Oswald, and as a character, as a fella, and he starts coming up with this idea of writing this story, fictional story, and base the main character on his impressions, or the impressions left on him by Lee Harvey Oswald. And eventually, Lee Harvey Oswald winds up disappearing from the Japanese radio base, and nobody knows where he went. We know now that he wound up in Russia before he does eventually come back to New Orleans, but they didn't know at the time. Kerry Thornley, he winds up graduating from the base there, and eventually winds up back in New Orleans as a dishwasher. Calls himself a Zen dishwasher. And in the meanwhile, while he's there in New Orleans, he continues to work on this mock religion, Discordianism, and the first book that winds up coming out of that called Principia Discordia. And he's also working on this work of fiction in which the main character is based on Lee Harvey Oswald. And Thornley is an interesting character, and it's even said that what he's doing is hanging around New Orleans, sort of LARPing himself as Lee Harvey Oswald. And again, this is all going on a few years before anyone really knows about Lee Harvey Oswald in relation to, John F. Kennedy's assassination and so on. Well, a few years pass. Yep. John F. Kennedy shot in Dallas, Texas. They arrest Lee Harvey Oswald. He says he's a patsy, but next day, Jack Ruby shows up. They're walking Lee Harvey Oswald's on television. Jack Ruby shows up, shoots Lee Harvey Oswald, and the Warren Commission, they proceed to do their thing. They investigate the assassination. They come up with their magic bullet and all the other stuff we're all very familiar with. And that's that. Well, a few years later, the case is reopened again by Jim Garrison, a district attorney of New Orleans. And if one is familiar with the movie JFK, Jim Garrison is the fellow that is being played by Kevin Costner in Oliver Stone's film. Well, as happens, Jim Garrison is very interested in speaking with Kerry Thornley about his familiarity with Lee Harvey Oswald and about this book that he's writing and all this other stuff, And the reason why this is relevant, one, it's just fucking bizarre. Second is winds up that Principe Discordia. Well, Principe Discordia and other works related to the Discordianism concern the pioneering of culture jamming, of subverting media. As happens, when Kerry Thornley goes to visit Jim Garrison at his office there in New Orleans, Kerry Thornley's girlfriend at the time sneaks into Jim Garrison's office and uses his Xerox machine to print off the first copies of Principe Discordia. So you've got this Discordian wizard who's entangled into something as wackaloon as is being investigated with his, as to his influence or relationship to an individual that people think assassinated the United States president. Very bizarre stuff. And when it relates to culture jamming and so on, and as it relates to a lot of what we're talking about here in this wild, wild west of the spiritual fringe and so on. Another fellow that Jim Garrison would have liked to have interviewed but couldn't because he had passed away just a couple of years or so before he had reopened the investigation, but he had intended to, was this fellow named Fred Krisman, who some had said they saw him on the grassy knoll there, and Fred Krisman, interesting cat. In 1947, Fred Krisman claimed to have been on a boat with a fellow and had seen a half a dozen donut-shaped UFOs flying near Mount Rainier in Washington State, and that one of the crafts they appeared to be damaged, and the craft was wobbling in the air that they saw, and eventually the craft came down. And they said as it came down, parts of the craft had broke off, and that one of the parts, Krisman claimed, had landed on the boat they were on and even killed their dog that was on the boat. And they had a little story about it. Well, the military quickly dispatched an investigator along with a pilot, seasoned pilot of a B-25 bomber. And when they get there, they interview these fellows, and shortly, in short time thereafter, they take off in this B-25 bomber this investigator and pilot, along with the debris from this alleged donut-shaped saucer craft that crashed on their boat. Well, their plane doesn't make it. They're heading towards a military base to have it investigated and so on and studied. Well, their plane doesn't make it there. The topmost surface of the story was that fog lifted, or fog came up. Seasoned pilot couldn't see, and flew that plane straight into Mount Rainier, and poof, it was gone. The parts, the debris, the investigator, the pilot, all gone. Well, Fred Krisman claimed that a little bit later that the story was a hoax. And he also claimed that he had formerly worked with intelligence agencies, and goes on to write these science fiction stories and have them published in Amazing Stories magazine back in the 40s. And the nomenclature, they're referred to as the Shaver stories, and they concern what Fred Krisman claimed to have been experiences of high strangeness that he had while he was in the military. Well. Then you wind up with this guy, right? Fred Krisman, who is a part of basically the, I should point out that 7 days after the claim being made about these UFOs being seen near Mount Rainier, 7 days following that, in 1947, we have the pilot Kenneth Arnold, who claims to see a number of craft flying near Mount Rainier that he describes as being like flying saucers, and it's where we originally get the term flying saucer from. It was coined in relation to Kenneth Arnold's sighting. And so you've got the baby bare bones of the UFO story, you know, what's in our skies and so on, that begins in the late 40s there. And one of the fellows claims to have been had worked with intelligence agencies in efforts to, subvert media and so on. And and then years later, this same fellow is not only suspected of being seen on the grassy knoll in Dallas, Texas, when Kennedy was shot, but that one of the other fellows, Clay Shaw, that Jim Garrison did interview, to point out that Fred Krisman was if not friends, an association with Clay Shaw, and another fellow who was also had worked with intelligence agencies. And again, you've got this the bare birth bones of the UFO story showing up in the late 40s in relation to what we end up seeing it evolve into. Not that it was the only thing, but it spreads out from there. Intelligence agencies are involved, deaths are involved, all this stuff. What's going on? And all the way up to including Kerry Thornley, Discordianism, culture jamming, all these things, Oswald being a patsy, and just on and on and on and on and on. And it makes you wonder, makes me wonder, would the fringe New Age spiritual revival, this particular iteration of it, and especially, would it look and behave and sound and just be the way it is, independent of any culture jamming? Is this just the way it would evolve, or does the effects of the culture jam have an influence, either a little or a lot, on what we see show up? Because if you're making a distinction between the bona fide occult, which is what's going on in our heads psychically, the experiences that we know of experientially, and this mumbo jumbo abracadabra occult, which is largely based on storytelling. Are we intellectually humble enough to point out to ourselves and sit with ourselves and really look and examine at how much of what we're talking about now is just the mimicry of storytelling, someone else's stories, and that experiences that we have had, episodes that we ourselves have had, are sovereign and independent of any of those story fills, and that we're kind of doing ourselves a phenomenological disservice, unbeknownst to ourselves, by leaning so hard into what is essentially could look like just scrambling the sci-fi pulp fantasy section of a paperback used bookstore. It's strange that things have worked out that way. But in a way, I'm almost glad that in some ways it seems such an obvious problem, because, easy to diagnose, easy to look at, not the easiest thing to solve, but at least it's easy enough to diagnose. And then one could pick apart what's on the public record and what's not, or, do the investigation that way. Whereas now, questioning and looking into it and having concerns over one's belief systems and so on, and it's almost seen as being beside the point. Like everyone's supposed to have some kind of airtight faith, and it's bless everyone's hearts and all that, but wowzers, man. Me myself, I guess 19, 20 years old, walking home at 3 a.m. On a winter day, on a winter morning. I see a craft in the sky the size, if not larger, than a fucking shopping mall, coasting low, just above the scattered clouds, and smooth as a riverbed stone, and slow, making, taking its own sweet ass time to get over me, and where finally the clouds thickened up and it disappeared altogether eventually. But as an episode, yeah, whopper wowzers, Meanwhile, as a phenomenologist, responsible, mental nimbleness, I have no reason to assign that experience to anybody else's storytelling. I'm at a psychological peril if I do. I can only examine what's in my lap. If I try to take someone else's word for what was in my lap, then that's going to lead me by the nose down a path that I cannot vet. And I worry about the influence of the mumbo jumbo abracadabra occult, because looking at the algorithm, boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Wow. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe it seems so strange to me because I'm still essentially a tourist of a world that, for the larger part of my life I didn't belong to. And so, I'm just a tourist here, but, wow. Start each day with green eggs and ham. I should not eat them, Sam, I am. Oh wait, I'm already on my second breakfast. Second breakfast. Should not eat them in a box. Shouldn't ought to eat them with a fox. Yeah, go kick rocks. I've already had way too much breakfast today. Come back tomorrow. Yep. I don't know. There's a lot more to this to look at. And good Lord, 25 minutes or more babbling on about it. Fuck, man. Takes a while to get into these things. Certainly takes an age to upload these things. Sam, I am Sam. I don't know. I'll listen back to this. If it sounds too fucking wackaloon, I'll just delete this like other things. But I don't know. Don't know what's helpful, what's not helpful, what's none of my business. You know, I guess, yeah, on some level, the wisdom would just be to sit still and say the fuck nothing about nothing, you know. But as it is, anything I can say, saying it in a vacuum.